more Mama than Nana. "Is she all right?" Damon asked. "Something's wrong, isn't it? Don't you think this is taking too long?" Unfortunately, I thought so too. "She's just fine," I said to the children. More time passed, slowly. Finally, I looked up and saw Dr. Coles coming into the waiting room. I took a quick breath and tried not to let the kids see how anxious and nervous I really was. Then Kayla Coles smiled. What a beautiful, glorious smile that was, the very best I've seen in a long while. "She's all right?" I asked. "Aces," she said. "Your Nana is a tough lady. She's asking for you already." Chapter 103. We visited with Nana in the recovery room for an hour. Then we were asked to leave. She needed to rest up. I dropped the kids off at school about 11 that morning. Then I went home to do a little more scut work in my office. I was looking into something for Ron Burns, a strange but intriguing case involving convicted sex offenders. In return, he'd gotten me some U.S. Army records that I wanted to check out. Some of it had come off ACIRS and RISS, but most came straight from the Pentagon. One of the subjects was the 3 blind mice. Who was the real killer? Who gave orders to Thomas Starkey? Who sanctioned the murders? Why were these particular men targeted? And most important, why were they set up instead of just having the 3 blind mice kill them? Was the goal to show them fear? Fear that they were being hunted? Fear that someone else had taken over their lives? I kept thinking about Nana and how tough she was and how much I would have missed her if something had gone wrong that morning. The terrible guilt-ridden fantasy kept running through my head that I was going to get a call from Kayla Coles, and she would say, "I'm sorry. Nana passed away. We don't know what went wrong. I'm so sorry." The call didn't come, and I threw myself into the work. Nana would be home tomorrow. I needed to stop worrying about her and put my mind to better use. The Army records were interesting, but also about as depressing as an IRS audit. Obviously, there had been rogue activity in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Army, at least officially, seemed to turn a blind eye and not look too closely at what had happened. There weren't civilian review boards, of course, like the police departments had to investigate misconduct. The press had no way to judge what was going on either. They rarely interviewed victims' families in the small villages. Few of the American reporters spoke much Vietnamese. The good and bad of it was that the Army had sometimes fought fire with fire. Maybe it was the only way to effectively fight a guerrilla war. But I still didn't know what had happened over there to inspire the murders stateside during the past few years. I spent several grueling hours looking through more records of Colonel Thomas Starkey, Captain Brownlee Harris, and Sergeant Warren Griffin. I saw that their Army careers were exemplary, at least in written form. I went back as far as Vietnam, and the pattern continued. Starkey was a highly decorated officer. Harris and Griffin were good soldiers. There was nothing in the records about assassinations in Vietnam committed by the trio. Not a single word. I wanted to know when they had met and where they had served together. I kept leafing through records, hoping, but not finding the connect point. I knew they'd fought together in Vietnam and Cambodia. I went through every page a second time, but there was nothing in any of the records to indicate they'd worked together in Southeast Asia. Not a goddamn word. I sat back and stared out onto 5th Street, letting my eyes glaze over. There was only one conclusion I could come up with, and I didn't like it. The Army records had been doctored. But why? And by whom? Chapter 104. It wasn't over yet. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, and I hated the queasy feeling, the uncertainty, the lack of closure. Or maybe I just couldn't let go. All those unsolved murders. Who was the real killer? Who was behind the strange murders? A week after the shooting in Georgia, I sat in Ronald Burns's office on the 5th floor of FBI headquarters in Washington. Burns's assistant, a crew-cut male in his mid-20s, had just brought us coffee in beautiful china cups. There were also fresh mini pastries on a silver tray. Pulling out all the stops, I asked the director. Hot coffee in Danish. You got it, he said. Shameless manipulation. Go with it. I'd known him for years, but it was only during the past few months that I'd worked closely with Burns. What I'd seen so far I liked, but I'd been fooled before. How's Kyle Craig doing? I asked him. We're trying to make it as uncomfortable as possible for him out in Colorado, Burns said. He allowed himself a smile. Craig was a former senior agent I'd helped put away. I still didn't know exactly how many murders he had committed, but it was at least 11, probably many more. Burns and I had believed Kyle was our friend. It was the worst betrayal in my lifetime, but not the only one. We have to keep him in solitary most of the day. For his own protection, of course. He hates being by himself, drives him crazier. No one to show off for. No psychiatrists in there trying to figure Kyle out? Burns shook his head. No, not a good idea. That would be too dangerous for them. Besides, Kyle would like the attention. He craves it. He's a junkie for it. Exactly. We smiled at the image of Kyle locked away in seclusion, hopefully for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, I knew he had made contact with others in the Max security unit, particularly Tran Van Lowe. You don't think Kyle had anything to do with these killings? Burns finally asked. I checked that out as much as I could. There's no evidence he knew Lowe before he was assigned to Florence. I know he visited out there, Alex, when he was still with the Bureau. He was definitely on the Max security unit as well as death row. He could have met Lowe. It's possible. I'm afraid you never know with Kyle. I almost didn't want to think about the unlikely possibility that Kyle might be behind the diabolical murder scheme somehow. But it was possible. Still, it seemed so unlikely that I didn't give it much credence. You had any time to think about my offer? Burns asked. I still don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry. This is a big decision for me and my family. If it's any consolation, once I land, I don't jump around. Okay, that's fine with me. You understand I can't leave the offer on the table indefinitely. I nodded. I appreciate the way you're handling this. You always this patient? Whenever I can be, Burns said, and left it at that. He picked up a couple of manila folders from the coffee table between our chairs. He slid them my way. I have something for you, Alex. Take a look. Chapter 105. More of the Bureau's resources that you want me to see, I said, and smiled at Burns. You'll like this. It's real good stuff. I hope it's helpful. I want to see you get some closure on this Army case. We're interested in this one, too. I reached into one of the folders and pulled out what looked like a faded patch from a jacket. I held it up to examine the cloth more closely. The patch was green khaki with what looked like a crossbow sewed into the fabric. There was also a straw doll on the patch. An eerie, awful straw doll. The same kind I'd first seen in Ellis Cooper's house. The patch came from the jacket of a 16-year-old gang member in New York City. The gang he belonged to is named Ghost Shadows. They use different coffee shops on Canal Street in New York as headquarters. It's called Roving Turf, Burns said. A task force we ran with the NYPD brought the gangbanger in. He decided to trade some information he thought might be valuable to the NYPD. It wasn't, but it could be valuable to you. How so? I asked. He says he sent you several emails during the past month, Alex. He used computers at a technical high school in New York. He's foot soldier? I asked, and shook my head in amazement. No, but he may be a messenger for foot soldier. He's Vietnamese. The symbol of the crossbow is from a popular folk tale. In the story, the crossbow could kill 10,000 men every time it was fired. The Ghost Shadows think of themselves as very powerful. They are big into symbols, myth, magic. As I said, this kid and his fellow gangbangers spend most of their time in the coffee shops, playing tinlen, drinking café soda. The gang moved to New York from Orange County in California. Over 150,000 Viet refugees have settled in Orange County since the 70s. The gang in New York favored Vietnamese-style criminal activities. Smuggling illegal aliens, called snakeheads, credit card fraud, software and computer parts heists. That help you? I nodded. Of course it does. Burns handed me another folder. This might help too. It's information about the former leader of the Viet gang, Tran Van Lo. Burns nodded. I did a tour in '69 and '70. I was in the Marines. We had our own recon people. They'd get dropped into hostile territory, just like Starkey and company. Vietnam was a guerrilla war, Alex. Some of our people acted like guerrillas. Their job was to wreak havoc behind enemy lines. They were tough, brave, but more than a few of them got incredibly desensitized. Sometimes they practiced situational ethics. Wreak havoc, I said. You're talking about terrorism, aren't you? Yeah. Burns nodded. That's what I just said. Chapter 106. The FBI flew me out to Colorado this time. Ron Burns had made this his case now, too. He wanted the person or persons behind the long string of murders. The isolation unit at Florence seemed as oppressive as it had been on my first visit there. As I entered the security housing unit, guards in khaki uniforms watched me through bulletproof glass observation windows. The doors were either bright orange or mint green. Odd. There were cameras every 10 feet along the bland, sand-colored walls. The cell where Tran Van Lo and I met had a table and 2 chairs, which were bolted to the floor. 3 guards in body armor and thick gloves brought him to me this time around. I wondered if there had been trouble recently. Violence? Lo's hands and ankles were cuffed and manacled for our meeting. The gray hairs hanging from his chin seemed even longer than at our last visit. I took the jacket patch Burns had given me out of the pocket of my coat. What does this mean? No more bullshit.
Ghost shadows. You know that already. The crossbar is just folklore. Just a design.
And the straw doll? He was silent for a moment. I noticed that Lo's hands were curled into fists.
I believe I told you that I was a scout for the American Army. Sometimes we left calling cards in villages. One, I remember, was a skull and crossbones with the words, "When you care enough to send the very best." The Americans thought that was very funny.
What does the straw doll mean? Is it your calling card? Was it left at all the murder scenes? Or afterward at the soldiers' homes? He shrugged.
Perhaps. You tell me, detective. I wasn't at the murder scenes.
What would this particular calling card mean? The straw doll?
Many things, detective. Life is not so simple. Life is not merely sound bites and easy solutions. In my country, popular religion is flexible. Buddhism from both China and India, Taoism, Confucianism. Ancestor worship is the oldest and most indigenous belief throughout Vietnam.
I tapped my finger on the jacket patch.
Straw dolls are sometimes burned or floated away on a river as part of rituals honoring the dead. Evil spirits are the ghosts of those who were murdered or who died without proper burial. The straw doll is a threatening message reminding the offending person it is they who should rightfully be in the doll's place.
I nodded. Tell me what I need to know. I don't want to have to come back here.
Nor should you. I don't have any need for confession. That's more a Western concept.
You don't feel any guilt about what's happened? Innocent people have died.
And will continue to. What is it that you really want to know? Do you believe I owe you something because of your crackerjack detective work?
You admit that you used me. Lo shrugged.
I don't admit anything. Why should I? I was a guerrilla fighter. I survived in the jungles of An Lao for nearly 6 years. Then I survived in the jungles of California and New York. I use whatever is provided to me. I try to make the most of the situation. You do the same, I'm sure.
Like at this prison.
Oh, especially in prison. Otherwise,